We're starting in a new chapter in succession, and this is anybody know what this is? Just off the top of their head? I mean, you can tell it's a volcano, but which volcano it is? Not Rainier. Thank goodness. That would be a disaster. Not Crater. Nope. You're in the right part of the world, at least. It's a mountain between those two. Yeah, right. Got it, Max. It's Mount St. Helens, and Mount St. Helens blew its top a number of decades ago now, and you can see that this explosion happened. We're basically looking towards the direction that the explosion came out of that blew the side of the mountain off. And there's a lake in there, Spirit Lake, which was basically blasted with steam and mud, and filled with a bunch of trees, dead trees, and that's this lake here. So it was sort of reset, and we're going to talk about succession, and so that's an interesting example of primary succession where you kind of started almost completely from scratch. When I was in college, I went on a ski trip where we skied across here and camped. It's a good thing it didn't blow up there, because that part does not exist anymore. That part of Mount St. Helens does not exist anymore. So we're gonna first talk about disturbance, and then succession, then indirect interactions and strong interactors. Okay, so responses to disturbance are dependent upon the characteristics of the disturbance itself and the organisms. And disturbance can vary by intensity, aerial extent, and frequency. So, if you pull a rock out of a stream, the inverts that are on it and throw it on the side, the inverts that are on it, the algae, that's a pretty intense disturbance. For the rest of the stream, it's a small aerial extent, so it doesn't have much effect, right? A flood like this that's really big is going to have obviously more effect than a spate. And we already talked about the Slatey River in New Zealand way back when we were talking about hydrology, which is on the west coast of New Zealand, and it flooded like every week. You couldn't have fish and invertebrates establishing there. So the intensity of disturbance and frequency of disturbance was so high that it had a really big effect. And then the organisms respond to the disturbance. And those potential responses might be colonization ability, resistance to the disturbance, so you can either be resilient, come back quickly, or resistance, you can resist any effects. So, and distance to refugia and growth rate. One of the, what are some potential examples of disturbance in wetlands, lakes, and streams? So go ahead and put something in there. Yeah, so we got some good examples: pollution, floods, droughts, dams, upsetting the connectivity of system, humans over exploiting fisheries. There's a whole bunch of them in freshwater systems. One of the questions is disturbance always bad for organisms, or is disturbance bad for every type of organism that you might find in a habitat? And why? Okay, so to get to that question, we had some good answers. Right, if you're adapted to disturbance, that's the one that's going to win. It's going to be good, and it might be good for you, and it might be keeping you in the system. We've talked about some things like disturbance maybe making it more likely for invasive species to get a toehold. We know that there's certainly different kind of weedy things that do better in disturbed habitats. So everything's not a disturbance per se for organisms, and this is one thing that we've really looked at differently in streams and rivers, that historically, early on, ecologists felt more like, a flood was this, disturbance thing. Now we've gotten to the idea of this natural flow regime, that the disturbance frequency, intensity, and area are part of the natural system, what species have evolved to. And so if you disrupt that with dams, get rid of all disturbance, that could be a bad thing. How do you think fishes and crayfishes get out of resist flood in Kings Creek? Anybody have a guess there? I just noticed resistance had diapause, but it's not diapause. Yeah, good. So we got some good answers here. They can maybe swim somewhere where it's not so intense. If you're a fish, you can just swim up into the shallowest part, and then as it dries, go back in. You can dig down in the rocks. A lot of species just dive down in the rocks and get down in there. And the crayfish have burrows, which are pretty resistant to flooding. So that if it's not too intense, then it could be plenty of food left afterwards, and they're fine. If it's a super intense flood, then maybe they'd be limited by food afterwards. So this is an example from Ken Fritz, who did research on Kings Creek. And Kings Creek is a intermittent stream, so there are lots of floods and droughts associated with storms. And it's a karst region, so it has limestone, and it has springs that serve as refugia that are upstream, pretty far upstream, so that you can get fishes and invertebrates and algae staying in those springs, and then when the water starts flowing and with higher precipitation connects everything, then they can come into that. So what he did is look at invertebrate richness at a bunch of different sites that varied and times. So he looked at the time since the flood, the intensity of the flood, how long it had been since it had dried before that, how long the dry period was before that, and the distance from the source of permanent water. And specifically, he found that the distance upstream was a key one, just because organisms tend to wash in more. Some macroinvertebrates adults can fly, or fishes can move up. But for the most part, he found for the invertebrates that this index, which is a composite of all those things. And we see that the more intense the disturbance gets, the harsher the environment gets, the lower the diversity is. So these are the species that are adapted to flood or drought, or moving quickly into a habitat. And this is just the species richness. And if you remember, this diversity index, H prime, gives you both evenness and species richness in the same index. And we see, again, a decrease in it. This approach has been used by other people in the Antarctic, in the dry valley streams, and they were able to construct a similar kind of index and show diversity effects. And these are the streams where the glaciers melt when the sun hits them for a little while, and run for a little while in the summer, and they're gone. Very simple algal communities, protozoans, some nematodes, and that's about it. So the historical idea of succession was this predictable sequence of community development after disturbance or a change in the environment. And we've already sort of seen this sort of classical view when we talked about eutrophication and natural versus cultural eutrophication, and how some lakes in glacial areas go through this sequence of events where they are first shallow and deep, but as they fill over thousands of years, they become a shallow pond, a wetland, and then eventually a meadow. And then we contrasted that to some lakes that don't go through that sort of successional natural selection processes, some of the tectonic lakes that are very ancient, for example. So this is one form of succession. There's also a thing called seasonal succession, which people think of sort of as winter as being this reset, and then everything redevelops after that, and then it resets and redevelops. So we'll talk about that in streams and lakes. Colonization after flooding in rivers, and we'll talk about wetland restoration and succession. So let's see. I don't have. Sorry. So here's the idea of seasonal succession in lakes, and this is pretty complex, but it's kind of cool because it builds on some of the ideas that we've been covering up to this point, from nutrient cycling to all the way to top-down control and that kind of thing. If we look then at the nutrients, we've already seen this phase here. So we have a lake that stratifies, mixes, a dimictic lake maybe, or maybe a monolithic lake, but one that stratifies during the summer at least. If we look at the silicon concentrations, it's high at winter and then it drops down. So why is that? Why does the silicon drop in the spring? And we already talked about this when we talked about the silicon cycle. Good, Lane. The diatoms use it up, right? So look, here's the population of diatoms. Whoop, up it comes in the spring. We get what's called the spring diatom bloom or spring bloom. And as it uses up the silicon, it moves out of the water and into the diatoms. Likewise, phosphorus is mixed, total phosphorus is mixed into the water column and it starts getting taken up by these diatoms. So why do the diatoms drop? So you can see there's this drop in diatoms. What do you think is causing that? Less silicon, that's one effect. And what's the other potential effect? So limiting nutrients, and Cassie got it, zooplankton, right? So here go the zoopers. They're taking off in the spring because all of a sudden there's a ton of food. What are they going to do? They're gonna basically knock that spring bloom out. And then we get these large grazer-resistant plankton like dinobrion and you know, those sort of big spiny kinds of things that we've seen, Melisira, those kinds of things, and they're more resistant to these zooplankton. Near the end of the summer, we tend to get cyanobacterial blooms. Why are those found at the end of the summer? Higher level of nutrients. It looks like there's lower levels of nutrients. Look, the phosphorus and the silicon are both coming down, right? Because and the light. Remember, the light lags. So the summer equinox is in June. The maximum light's in June, and that's another reason why the diatoms can do so well here, even though it's cold. The light's coming up pretty high in the spring, right? It's that the seasons lag the light intensity. These animals and the zooplankton and the algae are settling out, and so the epilimnion is becoming more depleted of nutrients. So light and nutrients, neither of those are the reasons why the cyanobacteria are necessarily doing well, except for there could be nutrients. They can come before the macrophytes, but the macrophytes can help. They can knock back the blooms for sure if there are macrophytes in the lake. Remember what the things are that stimulate cyanobacteria. And what's one characteristic of them? Or two, something that we've talked about as far as water quality. Anybody? Why don't we like cyanobacterial blooms? Anybody? They're toxic. Good, yeah. Right, so basically, there's zooplankton out here. The cyanobacteria are toxic, so the zooplankton aren't going to eat them. And then we can add into that, the other sort of key thing is, remember, they're the ones that do well at high temperatures. And this is when the warmest water is going to be, is in the end. So it's, the lake's going to continue to warm till late in the summer, and then it'll start cooling pretty rapidly. So there's a temperature thing going on here too. And perhaps you're running out of nitrogen. So if you're running out of nitrogen, all the nutrients are dropping out. Also, nitrogen fixation becomes important. So that's another possibility. Yeah, so here's the macrophytes. Don't do so well in the winter when they freeze. They grow throughout the summer and then they drop off again. And then the fishes follow the zooplankton. So first the zooplankton come out quick, and then the larvae of the individual fish species pop out. So the total young of the year fish maxes out and it comes down. But the all fish, the total biomass fish, doesn't change a huge amount unless there's some sort of winter slowdown in growth and production. Okay, so this is seasonal succession in the lake. And here's an example of zooming in on the fish reproduction. So this is an example. We talked about the possibility of there being a ghost of competition past. In this lake, the yellow perch numbers are high early on. The larvae are high early on. So they've adapted to quick early reproduction. Now this could be a good strategy or a bad strategy, because if the spring bloom isn't there yet and the diatoms haven't had time, and the zooplankton haven't had time to grow, then they could be out of luck that year. But it could be great because things could happen early, so it probably depends on which go. Log perch, black crappie, pumpkin seeds, and bluegills. And you see what they're doing is they're partitioning out the habitat by time. Now we can contrast that to a temperate stream and seasonal succession in a temperate stream. And if we look at the periphyton, periphyton are high in the spring and then drop off. Why do you think they might drop off in the temperate forested stream? And a hint, maybe look at the first panel, the top panel. Kind of the opposite. More light, lots of photosynthesis, right? Yeah, so basically the trees haven't leafed out yet, right? So the light can come in. The light's pretty high, and so the periphyton can do well. In addition, I think oftentimes in winter, the periphyton are a little bit less sensitive to cold temperatures. They can keep growing relatively more than the things that graze them, and so the invertebrates don't sort of slow down. And then in this case, we have a system that's flooding in the spring, so it's really knocking down the periphyton. And then eventually they'll come back up over the winter. We see, though, in this deciduous forest, we've got the leaves falling in the stream. So what type of invertebrates might be doing well with that? What functional group of invertebrates might be doing well with that? Shredders, good Gretchen. Right, so some of these slow seasonal insect larvae with winter growth are probably shredders because their food is really high here, right? And then they use it all up and it all decomposes by the time you get around here. Some of these long-lived species are not going to be affected by this much. So fishes that live multiple years, large, maybe predatory insects that could have multiple years between generations. Mosses grow very slowly, bryophytes, so they'd be there. So we see this this question here: why would a species have more winter growth related to food source? Well, because one, there's leaves in the stream if it's eating leaves, and two, there's more light, so the periphyton's coming back up again too, right? So we have a couple reasons for that. Okay, so next thing we'll talk about is a succession that's longer term, not the seasonal stuff, but some longer term. And this is succession following reservoir construction. And when you go from a river to a lake, it's a different habitat. Macrophytes oftentimes around here for sure are not very common in rivers because they have unstable bottoms. Some places they are, but when you, but there's this, they are definitely adapted to flowing waters. So after you build a reservoir, the macrophytes tend to become established and then become more diverse over the decade or so, if conditions are okay for macrophytes to become established. A lot of times what happens with these reservoirs is the productivity is high and there's this flooded vegetation. And so they introduce fishes that are sports fishes that like still water, but the fisheries just absolutely explode. They just take off. And then after time, the fish populations drop back down again because these nutrients that are released in the flooded vegetation are gone. One of the things that will happen in a couple months is an attempt to rectify part of this situation in a lot of reservoirs around the United States. Can anybody guess what I'm getting at? I'll be a little bit more specific. It tends to happen after December 25th and in January for the most part. Come on, some of the fish squeezers gotta get this one.
Can you repeat the question?
What is it that we sometimes try to reproduce this flooded vegetation to increase fish production that happens many years in many reservoirs and usually around the beginning of January? What is it that people do? And I sort of threw the hint in there, December 25th. Yeah, Aaron got it. Christmas trees for structures. So people are supposed to take all the junk off their Christmas trees and they drive them out to these areas in the lake and they dump them in. And they dump them in so it provides habitat for the larval fishes and structure and ways for them to get away. They try to reproduce that early part of reservoir succession where they flooded the forest and there's that whole forest sitting in there. And we just generally get this fish and invertebrate community shift from riverine to lacustre, from flowing waters to still waters and pelagic lake species. So essentially we have a situation where we're building a bunch of reservoirs in a place like Kansas where there are not many natural lakes. And we're really getting a sort of a unique assemblage of organisms and that wouldn't be there normally. The types of fishes that live in lakes, the types of invertebrates that live in lakes, all those things may not even be present in the watershed naturally, but are either stocked or worked their way up the streams or the rivers into that. So this is something that happens over decades, and you can think of it as a primary succession because you basically have no lake and you went to a lake, right? So that's a primary succession. Secondary succession is like the seasonal succession, or less intense, where you're not starting from a completely original spot. The idea of succession is also important in wetland restoration. And there's been sort of two camps historically, and I think the reality is somewhere in between these. But one of them is just restore the hydrology, and then if you do that, you can let natural processes restore the natural community. So they could either be a seed bank for when it was a wetland a long time ago. They can come in on waterfowl, and we talked about fish eggs and seeds maybe making it through the guts of waterfowl, or try to plant what you want in there. And the typical thing that's happened when people have done that is they plant these species they want to get in there, and most of them don't do so well. They don't survive there. Maybe because you haven't really created the right wetland soil or something like that. But if you wait, sometimes the species just won't come in. There'll be no source for them, or at least on our time frames. And so there is some argument that we do need to plant species of plants and we put them in. So the current view, I think, is in general is a blend of the approaches should be taken, depending upon what the purpose of the wetland restoration is. If it's if it's just for flood control, then people won't care. If it's for nutrient control, then you want to have plants that take up the nutrients that you can take out. If it's for wildlife, then you want to have a natural plants. So we can think of this as us looking at a habitat that's very disturbed, say a wetland that's been drained or something like that, and trying to put it back. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to speed this succession, this process of succession. I should go up and talk one more about this thing, this idea that we have this early on in succession, organisms have high colonization ability, resistance, distance refugia, high growth rates. So there are species, and this is the same kind of thing that we talked about. We can link it back to the to drying habitats, right? To ephemeral habitats, impermanent habitats. That the organisms that are able to colonize quickly and grow quickly will be the first ones in. And sometimes those organisms are required. So we have, for example, some algae that will not establish on rocks until there's a biofilm on there growing on there already. So keep in mind those ideas. Whereas the other long-lived species, maybe the big old cypress tree in the swamp, takes a long time to come in. Okay, I talked about indirect versus direct interactions, and one of the key questions that we have in community ecology is how long are interaction chains in natural communities. So you can think of, even though there's a web of interactions, each branch, you can go out each branch of that web and follow a chain from species A to species B, and however many species are in between. And you can imagine there would be these weird loops too, where so it's incredibly complex. So the question is, how far away are the effects occurring? And if you think about the way people talk about ecology not in the environmentalism sense, not ecology in the science of ecology. If you think about that, one of the things that people talk about is how everything's connected. Every little thread in the web of interactions is important. If you mess one thing up here, it's going to have a big effect over there. And that's not always true. Sometimes it will, and sometimes it won't, because of the way that interactions propagate, even if two species are not directly interacting with each other. So we know if we cut off all the primary producers, there's going to be effect way up the food web, or that one's going to go for long ways. We know maybe if we take out the large predator at the top of the food web, there'll be a trophic cascade that will shift things down below, and there'll be long chains. But maybe there's a little plant growing on the edge of the pond, and in one corner, and it goes away. It doesn't have much effect, right? It's just not interacting with that many other species. So trophic cascades are a good example of indirect interactions. I can't remember if I have anything. And I'll give an example that I talked about as a postdoctoral researcher in some of my papers. And the idea coming into this was, I thought that there would be a negative effect of epiphytes on the Cladophora, and that grazers would always fix that. And this came from the seagrass literature and the macrophytes and algae in marine systems, where if the grazers didn't take off the epiphytes, they'd get all shaggy, and they would be more likely to be ripped off the rocks by the waves. And so I thought this filamentous green algae in the streams would be more susceptible to flooding. In this case, the Cladophora can benefit the epiphytes by giving them a place to live, right? And indirectly grazers. And the grazers might help Caudophyra by lowering the amount of epiphytes that compete for nutrients and light. However, if you put in too many grazers, the Caudophyra get rid of all the epiphytes, and then they eat the Caudophyra directly. So it goes from an indirect interaction chain to a direct interaction chain. The other thing that got me thinking about Reynolds numbers and flow and such is that this is a filamentous thing, right? A bunch of filaments. And if you put epiphytes in, actually the water goes around the outside of them. And so they don't actually have as much drag. They're not as likely to get pulled off. But it does harm them in the sense that the nutrients can't diffuse in as well because of Reynolds numbers, small physical spaces, high viscosity, right? Low diffusion, low transport. So there were some ecological surprises in there that I was not ready for. So here's some examples of some indirect interaction. One more example of indirect interaction that you may not predict giving a system. And so we have this lake where fish were removed from a small, highly productive lake in late 1987. And their midge larvae are here, the snails are here, and the number of macrophytes are here. Okay, so this had multiple effects. The macrophytes took off because the turbidity went down. The snails took off and the midge larvae went off because the fish were eating the snails and the midge larvae. And they continued to stay high. But what they also did in 1990, after they did this removal, was put enclosures where they could put fish back in the lake. And when they did that, they didn't measure the macrophytes, but they did measure snails and midge larvae. And we can see that some of the midge larvae sort of came back, but their levels were way down from what they were without the fish. So they sort of allowed the lake to go back to having this. But the indirect interaction thing was the ducks took off, right? And this is not in enclosures, it's just these two are enclosures. The ducks took off. And by 1990, there were a lot of broods being produced by these ducks, a lot of eggs being laid. So why do you think the fish removal stimulated the ducks? More plants to eat, that's one possibility. They could be herbivorous, and what's the other thing that they might have more to eat? Right, more snails or midges, right? So it depends. Some ducks are invertebrate brooder eaters, and others are herbivores. So there's more food there, and that really stimulated. So we get these chains of interactions that lead to unpredictable effects at times in ecosystems, in freshwater ecosystems, in all ecosystems.